We were actually having some music, which we wanted to prepare for this. Just to set the stage correctly. But the thing is, there's a certain hint towards the theme of this session, obviously, and also that is the last one of this conference. We thought that was fun. That being said, Gert-Jan Bruggink, Sherman, two threat intel nerds, and we're going to talk to you today about the concept of attack trees. What we actually believe is that CTI is at an inflection point, just as this thing. Where's the other one?
You need to use this one, yes.
Merci. Just a cue. As I said, we think that CTI is at an inflection point right now. Economic climate is resulting in budgets being tightened. A lot of geopolitical situations actually demand other priorities. And that actually leads, we see on a daily basis, both Sherman and I see teams struggling with that, struggling to prioritize. With small teams, do much. In addition, the role of the CTI team is changing, or sometimes unknown. Rather than originally 10 years ago when we started from intrusion analysis, we went to analyzing that, attributing that, and then applying intelligence techniques and sort of creating a new ecosystem of which the CTI industry talked about a more technical level, while also you created a level which focused more on the analytical side. And what we're about to discuss today is that all of this and anything would benefit from a CTI mindset, even with a small team. And we really believe that CTI is not just about having a person in a certain role that does intrusion analysis or does strategic analysis. We actually think that it's all about decision-making and threat-informed decision-making. And especially if you have pretty strong stakeholders like you see on screen, you want to make sure that they make the right decisions. Otherwise, you'll die. And that is also true for the concept of attack trees. Because most of you probably, they have lived in a situation where you had to quickly identify or respond to perhaps vulnerabilities, something that has came out maybe last Friday at 5 o'clock where you just clocked out, right? Or maybe you had an incident where you were struggling to actually get that staffed correctly. Or maybe even you were actually done with the whole incident management phase and afterwards needed to actually prioritize what you want to do and improve afterwards. The fact is, we as security professionals, all we have is people, resources, basically, money and time. And we basically need to choose what we're going to do. Therefore, we need better decision-making. And therefore, we need some kind of mechanism, which in, the answer is CTI, obviously. But you need to make rapid decisions sometimes. And what we're going to talk to you all about today is applying that logic within the concept of attack trees. Because if you're, for example, building a planetary destroying capability, then it would be really bad if something happens to it, right? Fast forward to the present, maybe you're deploying a certain system, maybe you're putting a new service online. But the logic of attack trees will actually help you on that. And we're going to give you a practical talk on that today. Full disclosure, I'm not saying this is easy. I'm saying this is a good method to apply that. And we're taking our more deeper approach to how you apply this. Doesn't mean that you have to do it the same way we do. What matters is that you take the lessons we share with you today. So Sherman, what are attack trees actually in the first place?
Great question. Thank you. And so let's go a little bit old school here. So attack trees, let's go back to circa 1980s. Attack trees, or threat trees really, right, is a conceptual diagram that helps us understand how a target or an asset may be attacked, right? So it helps us visualize attack scenarios, it helps us threat model, but more importantly so, it supports decision making, specifically defensive courses of actions that we can take to really prioritize defenses and our resources to defend against. So on the right side, you can see here is like a really old school threat tree, right? by Jonathan Wise back when Bell Laboratories was still a thing in the 1980s. But as you can see, this is like a sort of a diagram in which they're trying to map out how a threat actor can obtain admin privileges. Once again, this is in 1980s, folks. So a lot of our concepts that we're using right now is all rooted in the past, 20, 30 years ago. Actually, 40 years ago, sorry.
For those of you paying attention, take a look at the names in the tree.
Yeah.
There's some similarities on certain frameworks.
So let's talk about the history of attack trees and sort of that concept, right? So as I've mentioned, it was first published by Jonathan Wise in the 1980s. He called it threat trees. Later on in the 1990s, we know Bruce Schneier, pretty famous. He also published attack tree concepts, right, with some modification, some expansion of that tree concept. And in between the 1990s and the 2000s, we see a lot of development, modification, expansions, if you will, of that tree itself. Some more catered towards perhaps vulnerability analysis work, right? Now let's fast forward to 2013. So that's when the Diamond Model white paper came out. In that, the authors did say that they have incorporated elements and components of the attack tree in what they would call the activity attack graph, right? To help us really comprehend at a more complex level of threat actors' behaviors and intrusions in campaigns. Now let's fast forward to present day, where two nerds in a conference talking about this. Okay. So let's break down attack trees and really look at the quirks and features of the whole system. So classical attack trees usually only have one root, right? And numerous different nodes and leaves and children nodes, right? The root itself is the primary objective of what the threat actor wants to accomplish. So in this case, to open a safe. This example is from Bruce Schneier. And obviously, when you look down at the tree itself, a lot of them are the actions that they need to partake in order to really achieve that objective. So in this case, to open a safe, they can either choose to pick the lock, learn the combo, cut the safe open, or have someone bribed and installed improperly, right? Multiple options here. You can also add meta features, if you will. For example, in this case, cost of attack. Does it require special equipment, right, to actually achieve? And with these extra features, it really helps us understand what I would call the path of least resistance, right? Like, what would the threat actor choose? Is it too expensive by choosing this side versus the other side, and so on and so forth? Now, when you look at this right now, this classical attack tree, you might notice that there's only one root, right? There's only one objective, right? This classical sort of system. So, as I already mentioned, that there are now more modern concepts that incorporates this, but it really expands it out. So let's talk about some of the contemporary cyber threat intelligence practices, frameworks, and taxonomies that we can incorporate into this mindset of like tree analysis work and system thinking. There you go. All right, so we had over a decade, more than a decade now, really, of a lot of CTI taxonomies and frameworks, right? In 2011, we had what was popularized by Lockheed Martin and a lot of vendors, the kill chain, which is really a truncated understanding of sequences and phases in which attackers need to accomplish to then action on the objective, right? By no ways perfect, but it is a way that is truncated so that both technical analysts and also strategic stakeholders or leaders can understand and digest rather quickly. And around the 2013 and 2014, we have additional frameworks. By the way, this is not exhaustive, but we did pick these out as examples and major examples. So going back to the Diamond Model. So Diamond Model is really, as I mentioned, a way for us to really understand adversarial behaviors, intrusions, and campaigns. So to simplify, for sake of this presentation and the duration of it all, the Diamond Model is really essentially how we can describe how an adversary leverages infrastructures, right, to execute capabilities to target against the victim. And then now we also have MITRE ATT&CK, which in essence is a shared taxonomy, a shared language, if you will, in how we can describe threat actor behaviors, right? So everybody's talking the same language, there are no misconstruction, hopefully, so that we can all understand how to think about the threat itself. So now when we combine them all, what we now have is more of a sequential understanding of the threats. This is an extract from the actual diamond model intrusion analysis white paper. But as you can see, all these diamonds here, or events, right, are chained together or related together in a sequential format. It really helps us understand the critical junctures that make or break actor intrusion attempts. Within the diamonds itself, when you zoom in, really, you can see that we can input information about the adversary itself, the infrastructure that they use, what capability they use, what techniques, right? In this case, MITRE attack techniques, or even tactics, however you want to put it, and really understand that capability, and also victim information. Now, I do want to say that we don't always have to fill in all 4 core features, because in reality, we don't always have all the information. We work, most of us here will probably agree that we work with partial information, right? Sometimes we don't have any visibility at all in who the adversary is until later down the road. Perhaps we only have partial visibility in the infrastructure that they're using, right? Because we just don't have the telemetry. We don't know how they prepared all these infrastructures. So it's okay to not fill it all, but we should try our best to input as much information into these diamonds as possible to really understand, the behavior, the characteristics, and the attributes of the threat actor itself. Missed the points. All right, Gert-Jan, you want to expand about a little more?
Yeah, sure. I also want to add that on what Sherman just mentioned, we are looking at this as a template where you can either, if you need more detail, you can actually dive deeper and use the diamond model accordingly. You don't have to, right? So for example, if you just want to stay more abstract, then you can just fill it in using the diamonds as maybe icons, right? So just to be clear for everyone, this is about using contemporary models and then figuring out what you use and what you then need to communicate with your stakeholders depending on their desire for information. And that is also something that helps you to think about what are the things you actually do not know. Because if you're starting to model stuff out, then you kind of know like, hey, this is some of the areas we might not see coming. Maybe there's areas, things we do not know yet. And that concept we call postulation. So where we actually try to infer and think about, hey, we have a hypothesis that is not just a vulnerability that's getting exploited, but it could also be that a potential repository in GitHub gets compromised by a long-term APT exercise, and therefore we should actually consider that at the top of our attack tree of that given thing. So this is all about thinking about what you know and think about what you actually don't know. And that is, and for us, this is a very, in our daily practice, at least for Sherman and me, this is a very important aspect because we also, the fact that the bar on the right bar on the left, that is also areas where you can develop hypotheses for hunting, for threat hunting, intelligence-led threat hunting, but also testing. Maybe you want to penetration test a certain element. Maybe you want to actually get that validated. But then you actually have to make a decision on where you want to do something about. What are we going to focus on? What is the explicit thing we're going to focus on? And using this kind of visualizations that helps you actually tell that story and explain it much better to everyone. And then you can also make a decision on where you actually want to defend. There's probably a Sun Tzu quote in here somewhere for the specialists. But the idea should be is that you can then decide we are protecting ourselves against this particular threat. They will take these most likely routes. And with that thinking, we should definitely task our team A and team B on actually severing that particular tie in the attack chain. By doing so, you can actually make this real visual. And I can tell you this, people love this. Because by nature, we're all actually pretty visual. As human beings, we are visually oriented. But the reality is that with being cyber threat intelligence professionals, you do have to have the underneath details, the underneath research to actually get to this level of abstraction, for example. But anyway, that's about conscious decision-making. And the final thing I'd like to say about that is also explicit decision-making. For those of you involved in this practice, you obviously have seen people make implicit decisions and say, yeah, we're going to focus on that. But if you're in a crisis, for example, an incident you're managing, then you don't have time. Who takes accountability and ownership of a certain decision that has been made? You know? If you're in a large organization, and we both support a lot of large organizations, then it could be that you don't have time, literally don't have time to wait until you get the all clear to actually physically separate two environments because the ransomware is already spreading. So therefore, having these kind of visuals and understanding quickly provides leadership and insight on where we need to make decisions and how and what we can do about it. Now, obviously, that is a story you have to tell a bit better, not by saying, yeah, sever it there. So it's also about what can we actually specifically do about that. And we're going to borrow some materials from the MITRE Ingenuity team for that. And they broke down actionability into detections and mitigations. But I think what is much more useful is to look at it as a certain calculation, where actionability is just one part of the whole equation, of the formula, so to say. So it's not just the actionability, what we can actually do about it, but it's also about where is the prevalence of a given technique? You know, where do we have the biggest bang for the buck? And that leads us to choke points in an attack chain. And that's interesting, because for us as professionals, we really want to pinpoint, where, simply put, where can we have the biggest bang for the buck? You know, what is the most effective thing what we can adjust? Because we have limited budget. We don't have time to create detection use cases for everything. So we really want to understand the modeling behind that and really understand where do we focus on. So there's actually some mental models. I'm not saying you should use exactly this. I'm saying you have to think about how you get to the most significant techniques for your organization. And there's actually some ideas like this that can help you. So this team actually went a bit further, and they actually created an Excel file, which we had found extremely useful. And I actually recommend all of you to take a look at that. And what this team did is they already made some calculations about what they actually do with it. And since we all love Excel, obviously, because we as an industry obviously didn't move on from Excel, right? But the idea is that you now have an ability to actually say, this is what's publicly available in terms of controls or techniques that are being used, and they actually mapped it into, for example, the number of Sigma rules. Right? And if you can actually, if you research that for your particular attack tree, what you will find is actually you can identify choke points within like 5 minutes, probably. It will take you not a lot of time. And this is freely available. You know, not a lot of people know this stuff, but this kind of stuff is really readily available for you to use. But I think the essence of this all is also what do you actually do with it, right? So I once was in an organization and they decided, we're going to implement data leakage prevention, and we're going to stop particular text files from using that, because that is exactly what has been used in the attack tree of a given actor or a given subset of actors. But the reality is the entire R&D department of that business was actually running on those text files. So the moment they deployed the DLP, it actually shut down the complete business operations altogether, right? And we have seen there's many, many examples, and probably all of you have multiple of these. But the essence is you cannot just decide if we have found a choke point that is actually the best decision you have to make on degrading that. Sometimes you have to have, maybe you want to keep the system maybe a bit more ineffective and choose another one in order to preserve the business operation, right? In this case, the Death Star canteen, right? But also, if you're using the Star Wars metaphor, if you're building like cannons and making sure that is pointed outwards, then you also have to think about, maybe we need to set a system in that if we have planes flying outside, then it has consequences for, how do we do the defenses, for example? Which spacecraft should we target, which spacecraft shouldn't we target? So there's a deeper metaphor in that also it's not just about the current controls, the current decisions you make, but also in the future it has implications. And going back to that modeling view, that will help you and actually go through the discussion much more effective. Now, this is a bit the background about what we think you should be doing. So, but we also thought it would be useful to actually guide you through a practical example. Again, this is, we apply, you can make it as complicated and as simple as you like. So we don't have any issues with that. What we do think is if you're going to start with this, there's actually 3 elements on when you actually make these attack trees. So some of you actually make them real time. We had people in the workshop, for example, on Monday, and they make them every single day, right? Interestingly enough, a different mental model for you to use could be, hey, you're currently in incident response mode, and now you basically want to quickly visualize something in 20 minutes or 30 minutes, because that's usually the time when you're running an incident, that's the only time you have. The beauty of it is that everything we discussed today is actually doable in less than 30 minutes, but that level of depth forces you to have a bit more, just literally spend more time on that. And the more time you actually spend on it, actually the more people you probably need. So maybe in incident response mode, it's much more like, hey, we just quickly put something on the whiteboard. But maybe once you have done that, maybe you actually want to take and sit a moment and keep somebody separate and actually have a deliberate thought about that. And finally, this kind of granularity allows you to have more deliberate assessments, really in-depth, talking with the team, what did we see, what did we discuss. And the last phase on the right is also focused more on over days, so where you have a lot of understanding of everything. And so what we also try to do is at the top right, try to emphasize what you can do at any stage of these 3 phases, basically. But also, in the first thing we think we should do is actual deliberate orientation of the situation. This may sound silly, and it might sound not useful, but the reality is that a lot of people don't actually do this. You know, maybe sometimes when if you've been involved with incident response cases or managing certain threats, then usually sometimes the first answer is, where are the IOCs? But that is not the right question to ask. The right question to ask is, what do we know about ourselves? You know, what do we actually think we don't know about ourselves? And can we move more about what do we know about this particular situation we're dealing with? And this kind of thinking is, for us, it's the baseline on where we decide maybe we should go with attack trees, maybe we should not do and just start running. But usually what will happen is we actually move into then maybe we should visualize this, and we actually need to do something about that. So then the next step is obviously like, how do you practically do that? So in our experience, low fidelity is key with these things. Whiteboard, physical paper, literally, charting apps, We can make the template, by the way, available after the session. That's definitely, by the way, not an issue. But I want to emphasize that currently there are no good technical solutions to build cool graphic visuals. If you found one, please share it with both of us. We're really interested in that. But what we found is that this is a niche of the market on quickly displaying decision-making information in a good visual way is very difficult, and we haven't found a good solution yet. And finally, you need people, smart people, who are able to actually explain it, do the analysis on that.
Thanks. All right, so let's do a quick simplified example of how we can apply all these concepts and mindsets together, okay? So, hypothetically speaking, we are an an OT organization, critical infrastructure organization, and we have assessed that a full typhoon is one of our primary threat actors that we should be concerned of. So we're tasked with 2 things. One, to really understand the behavior, their intrusions, their sort of sequential attack flows, but also how do we defend against it? How should we prioritize our resources and allocate our resources to defend against said threat actor group? So good news is that there's a lot of reportings out there that are pretty well, really detailed. And if we only have 30 minutes to really scribble it out, we can still do this. As you can see on the right side here, the events really are just 2 or 3 words, 4 words max, some of them. And at least at that point, within 30 minutes, you can still describe the procedures that they're using. And through reading and then just try to compile things together, we can get a rough tree out, as I would call this. But it still allows us to really understand how this all fit together, and visually look at sort of the threat actor's ability, so to speak. Now, of course, once we have a little bit more time, we can be, if we're allowed to be more deliberate, we can now start adding in more information into these procedures, right? For example, in the second event here, which is the living off the land for execution, we can start adding all these information in, at least the ones that are publicly available or whatever sources you may have, right? So, Full Typhoon uses compromised Soho network devices with these capabilities combined together to target Windows servers. You can also, in addition, put in phases that really helps you understand what at that time or at that point of that intrusion, what they're trying to do, right? In this case, perhaps it's a lateral movement, perhaps it's the collection. Now, to the point about the postulated events, there's a lot of things that a lot of these reports are covering, that they have observed something, but that's not complete. So we can still add these as postulated events to really help us understand the known unknowns, or perhaps the plausibility of certain extra additional events. Okay, so now that we have a very sized out graph, or attack tree here, if you will, now the next step, the next task really is, how do we defend against this threat actor? How should we prioritize our resources, our limited resources to really try to deter, disrupt, defend against this threat actor group? All right, well, let's just take the second procedure here as an example and really drill that down a little bit here. Specifically, let's look at PowerShell. Okay, going back now to that prevalence, choke point, and actionability perspective here. So we all know that, based on the report, we know that the threat actor really loves the command scripting interpreter. They use PowerShell all across the board. So from that perspective, we know that this is a high prevalent technique that they're applying. From a choke point perspective, we know that there are numerous techniques that flow prior to the technique, the command scripting interpreter technique, and then subsequently a lot of other techniques can be executed after the fact, right? So high prevalence, robust choke point technique. The third part here, so it's also the actionability side of things. So we know, so let's just hypothetically say that you are a Splunk shop. We can at least use Splunk's security content to understand what's available out there. Now, the one thing I do want to caution is that please don't apply out-of-the-box detection use cases right off the bat without fine-tuning, understanding your environment, because you're going to cause a lot of false positives, right? But it still gives us a good point of reference of how detectable is this, or like what kind of data sources do we need, right? So additionally, we can also map this back to controls, prevention, right? MITRE Threat-Informed Defense, Center for Threat-Informed Defense also has mappings to NIST. I know it's a little bit more Americanized, and that NIST 853 is more American, but it still helps us understand what kind of controls can we apply to really limit the abuse of command and scripting interpreter or PowerShell. So now when you combine all these together, we now know that this technique alone is pretty highly actionable, or just is a top technique that we should focus on. And if we combine it all with the two other techniques into that one procedure, we can say that perhaps this is the part that we want. This is the procedure that we want to prioritize. Okay, but back to the point: can we actually do we have the ability to defend against it? Do we have does it disrupt business operations? Right. For example, if you're an organization that uses heavily PowerShells, bless your heart, you might cause a lot of false positives, right? Coincidingly too, as well, if you block PowerShell from off the bat with GPO, whatever, will it actually disrupt IT admin operations? These are very key questions that we need to ask and engage our IT admin stakeholders and everything else to really get an understanding, a full picture of the recommendations that we would bring forth to the defensive members of the organization. So.
To add to what Sherman just said, that's exactly where you then see, hey, we're going to propose to block PowerShell, and that's the moment where people say, you're not going to block PowerShell, right? These are kind of discussions you want to make, with the right stakeholders and the right people involved, because it has sort of like big impact. And truth be told, this is also from a conceptual perspective where you sometimes see CTI teams, and maybe people in the room here as well, struggle with actually telling that story, right? But using this kind of visual narrative, this visual format, that can just help you. We're not, again, reiterating, we're not saying that you actually have to use this exact model. But what we're saying is there are multiple models which you can actually use, and we created all of them in the last 10 years to better understand the level of granularity we might need. That's exactly what we're saying. And what you actually see is that we can really specifically pinpoint and say, this is some of the stuff we don't know, and we actually think it's better to focus on that first. And you can do that any stage in the situation you're in. If you're in combat mode, if you're in resting time, whatever you call it, if you're in emulation, if you're in simulation, if you want to just see how an incident plays out, this is the kind of stuff where you really use an attack tree for, and also apply this kind of logic as Sherman shared with you today. So to wrap it up, we really believe, and you probably already figured this out, that we don't dictate attack trees as a model that as it has been intended as a graphical visualization in the 80s. It's just a mental model, right? And you can use it horizontally. During the conference, there was also another speaker who also applied the same logic. You can make it more complex. You can make it with percentages or anything associated with it. We really believe that this is a mental model which just adapts with the flow of time. You know, in the next 5 years, we'll hopefully figure out maybe some new taxonomies, maybe something even cooler. I don't know. We'll see what happens. But what is important that this kind of logic actually allows you to combine both the external, internal threat landscape with the defensive measures associated with it. And this is basically your visual narrative guide to do that decision making. Yeah, and that being said, on the final note, this is exactly where explicit decision making comes back into. Because this is the way where we've done our research, we told people what to do, and it doesn't matter if it's a SOC engineer, it doesn't matter if it's a security leadership, it doesn't matter if it's business. It's about deliberate and conscious decision making, and this tool will help you for that. That being said, this is Sherman Chu, Gert-Jan Bruggink. These are our contact details, and we'll open it up for questions now. Thank you.